Well, I figured I'd take some time because I've been talking about it for a while to discuss the first and second Boer War. Having some coffee, the cat mug. So, the Boer War took place in the late 1800s. Specifically, the first Boer War was, I believe, 1888, and then the second Boer War was 1899. And these are pretty much forgotten uh, conflicts that took place between Dutch settlers in what today is Zimbabwe and Mozambique and parts of South Africa against the British Empire. And why it's so important is basically the political implications of the Boer colonies and sort of how they were run and how they were successful. Kind of the fact that these colonies were so successful with absolutely no form of organized government was, at least in the case of the first Boer War, was is pretty fascinating to someone like myself who was an anarchist. So before the Boer War started, or rather what led up to it, you had the Dutch East India Trading Company settled what was called at the time the Cape Colony, and they made it a stopover on the shipping route to India to get spices. It was the way it worked back then is if you were poor, didn't have land or something like that, and you lived in Holland at the time, you could sign up with the Dutch East India Trading Company, and they would basically put you on a boat with your family, send you off to one of these colonies, give you some land and a responsibility, um, and you'd basically you just maintained this patch of Dutch sovereign ground in a foreign land. That was your job. You farmed it, you paid taxes, you helped out where it was needed, and it was a pretty good deal. Especially if you're in some sort of city back in the Victorian days, that was not a pleasant life. If you weren't a landowner, you did not fare very well. And there was a lot of things with religious implications and things like that. There was a lot of various forms of Protestantism going on back then that weren't always popular, and so it'd be kind of hard to say if you were a Quaker, find a job, things like that. Um, so a lot of these people would sign up for these things and go, and so you get your Dutch East India Trading Company and your Cape Colony there, and the Dutch, and so on and so forth. But what happened was the rule of the Dutch colony there got kind of fascist. It became very oppressive to be a Dutch colonist there. The East India Trading Company wanted, you know, a large majority of the crops you produce. They wanted, a great deal of your earnings. And then on top of that, if there was any sort of issue, you were handed a gun and you were sent off to go fight. Like in the case of the Zulus, were constantly trying to reclaim the land, which is interesting because the Zulus actually, or specifically, I believe it was the Bantu tribe, which is an offshoot of the Zulus. They weren't originally natives to the land. They sort of came in there and slaughtered the peaceful tribe that lived there and took it as their own. And then, of course, they turned around and said that the Dutch colonists stole it from them, which is a little nefarious. So eventually, world economics changed. The Dusty East India Trading Company sort of falls apart, and you've got all these Dutch colonists there now who don't have any sort of government or anything like that, and they decide that because the the company's rule was so oppressive, um, they decided they weren't going to do that again. We go, we have this opportunity to start fresh. We're just going to we'll have our farms, we'll have general assemblies, if something happens, we'll come together, but we're going to make this basically a voluntary anarchist society. We're going to do our own thing, and, you know, that's all there is to it. Say hi, Zabu. So some time goes by, and these guys are basically the Boer, as they were called, the Dutch colonists. A few generations go by, they become the Boer instead of Dutch colonists. This is their land. The British sort of say, hey, this is a good little spot for a stopover to India. I think we should start, moving in here. So they did. And the Dutch colonists were sort of like, you know what? It started to get a little politically hairy. The British are very, back then, especially in the Victorian time, they were a monarchy, very strict, blah, blah, blah. And the Dutch colonists didn't want to deal with it. So they moved up north and they founded a colony called the Transvaal, which is in what is part of modern day Zimbabwe and part of modern day Mozambique. They basically left and said, yeah. So another interesting thing happened. Now, when they moved up there, they bought the land from the Bantu tribe. They negotiated with the king of the Zulus and said, "Hey, we'd like to buy this land." The Zulu king says, "Sure, here you go. This much, so and so." So they pay him. They move in, and the Zulus promptly turned around and attacked them. That's considered to be the first Boer Zulu War. They basically, and they won. They had superior firepower. They were using, basically single shot breech loading rifles. The Zulus were using, spears and wooden shields and things like that. Stuff that was effective against the tribe that lived there before them, but not so much on European settlers. So sure enough, British people are flooding into the Cape Colony. The Dutch are, they start moving up and getting involved in the Transvaal. And they decide, you know what, we're going to annex this area too. And they don't do it like peaceably. They start moving in there and just basically saying, we're the law now. And a couple of times, they tried to impose taxes on the Boer farmers who were like, who the fuck are you? And why are you making me pay taxes? And basically the first shots came when a contingent of British government seized some farm equipment from a farmer for not paying taxes to, basically not his government. Not these people just moved in and were like, hey, you owe us taxes. And the Boers were like, wait a fucking minute. No, we don't. So when they set up the auction to sell off this guy's property, 100 armed Boers showed up and basically raided the auction, took the stuff back. That was it. The actual firefight broke out when the British sent colonial troops in to quell the riot, basically, which is what happened. And another thing led to another. They began exchanging fire with each other. This went on for a few years. It was pretty small scale. And eventually the British said, you know what? This area up here in the Transvaal is basically just plains farmland. There's nothing here for us. There's no reason for us to get drawn into a conflict. There was a rebellion going on in India, and there's always issues with their colonies in Indochina and things like that. So it was just like, you know what? So they basically signed a truce with the Boers and said, we'll stay here, you stay there, and everything's fine. So that lasted for a good couple of years, and then all of a sudden, gold was discovered in the Transvaal. And now, of course, by this time, you don't just have the Transvaal, you have the Zoeid Afrikaan Republic, the Orange Free State, and then, of course, the original Transvaal. These were three different Boer countries that came of the First Boer War. And you're talking, the northern part of what is now South Africa, again, Zimbabwe, Mozambique. They discovered gold, diamonds, and I can't remember what else. But anyway, so the Boer realize this, and they go, we're basically a nation of very spread out farmers. And of course, the British are down in the Cape Colony chomping at the bit to get up in there and start mining these resources out that the Boer just really don't care about. They just want to work the land and not have anything to do with it. So they say, you know what? We will let some British miners come in and you can take your diamonds or whatever the fuck and just leave. But you can't participate in our society. You're not to be trusted, basically, because the last time this happened, of course, the British moved in and basically were like, okay, this is ours now. And they didn't want that to happen again, understandably. So they said, hey, you're not going to have any general elections or assemblies or anything like that. You come in here, you mine your shit, and you fucking leave. So the British are like, oh, yeah, sure, that's all we want to do, blah, blah, blah. And time goes by, you get more and more British miners in the area. And British military starts showing up because, oh, well, we want to protect the miners from this and that. And there'd been a few squabbles and stuff like that. People saying this land is mine, that, so on and so forth. You know how it goes. So this goes on for a couple of years. And eventually the British are like, you know what? This area should be a democracy. And now that we're in the majority in this area, because it's true, I mean, you've got a couple of Boer farmers, and then you have all these British subjects that had fled and basically poured into the country to mine. They decided that they want to vote, have elections, and basically, in a roundabout way, once again, annex these colonies. So the Boer said no. The British subjects began rioting. British soldiers began sneaking into the Transvaal, the Zuid-Afrikaan, and the Orange Free State, and basically you started having the same shit again, except this time the Boers organized themselves and mounted an attack on the British towns. They were not going to fuck around this time. And this was in 1899. And now, what's impressive about this is now with both wars, you have basically farmers with no organized government and no organized military. And at this point, they were standing ready to beat the most powerful empire in the world a second time in battle. And it's interesting, too, when you think about that, you hear a lot of things today about, oh, well, you can't do anything about the government. There's nothing you do. If a handful of Boer farmers can beat the mighty British Empire, I think that, as long as you are a competent individual, you are in charge of your own freedom. And if somebody tries to take that freedom away from you, you need to stand ready to act. And that's something that's very important. And the Boers taught us this lesson twice. Another interesting thing, of course, is the British equipment at the time. They were using long Lee Enfield rifles that fired a semi-smokeless powdered cartridge. And they would file in ranks, single-load rifles, and fire on command, as did every mighty European empire at the time. The Boer commandos, as it came to be known, would often fire from horseback. They would set up ambushes. And they carried Serbian and German Mauser 1895 7mm rifles, which were very flat shooting. They fed from a stripper clip, which were extremely fast. And these Boers would go around. There's iconic pictures of them basically with these big bandoliers of ammunition on horseback. And they gave the British a run for their money. I mean, it was defeat after defeat. And it wasn't until, I believe, the 1900s when the British force finally overwhelmed the Boer. They just couldn't. It became basically at that point, we're the mighty British Empire. We are not going to lose a second war to this rabble, basically. And national pride. So they put the full might of the British Empire to bear on these people. And they still, I mean, for years and years and years, they withstood. And it's extremely impressive when you hear about it. It got to the point where the British people were actually sort of idolizing these Boer commandos. They became like, they were on trading cards and toys and things like that. They were sort of, they considered them the bad guys, but they were sort of this sort of hero figure to them almost. So that's interesting. And then, of course, the what happened after the Boer War. The Boer finally, we can't do this forever, and so they surrender to the British. The British turn around and put Boer civilians and soldiers in concentration camps, and they starve them to death, to the point where this is before League of Nations, United Nations, the world's governments actually got involved and put a stop to this. They were systematically exterminating these people after they had surrendered. And you want to talk about what Nazi Germany did to the Jews. Think this is what England did to the Boer after the Second Boer War. And that's something that a lot of people would like, especially the British, would like to forget, is the fact that they, in their history, have been just as bad, if not worse, than the Nazis that they spent something like 1 million British subjects fighting. So. And I mean, this is stuff, when I don't even know if this is true today, but I doubt they even mention it in history class in high school or anything like that anymore. You might get a paragraph. But these things, these little forgotten things in history, are of such monumental importance, especially if you're into sort of political philosophy like myself. You can't just sit there and discount things because they don't seem reasonable. And the facts that we take away from the Boer War is that anarchy is not only feasible, but it's prosperous. And I mean, you're talking about anarchy defeated monarchy in this case. And there's a lot of examples like this throughout history that you just don't learn about. And it's a good idea for you to go out there and, don't take what I've said here as the end all be all, because I definitely left a lot of shit out. There's a lot of fascinating facts that took place. But, go out there and if you believe in something, and people tell you, hey, that's I don't think that's not reasonable. That's because they read a paragraph about these things in a history book and they're too busy, chewing gum. And go out there and find out about these things. Go out there and look at historical examples, that's really about it. But, don't take my word for it. Go read it yourself.